Hello and welcome to the AI Innovation and Business Podcast with Daniel Halbert. Today we have a very special guest, Chuck Freilich. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, the timing is perfect to have you on the podcast, and I'm really excited for our viewers. So, just to give some background for everybody, Chuck Freilich is the former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor and current INSS senior researcher. Chuck Freilich is a prominent Israeli security expert who spent over 2 decades in Israel's defense establishment before entering academia. He served as Israel's Deputy National Security Advisor and later became a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. Today, he teaches political science at institutions including Tel Aviv University, Columbia, and NYU, and edits the Israel Journal of Foreign Affairs. Freilich is the author of Zion's Dilemma, which he wrote in 2012, Israeli National Security in 2018, and Israel and the Cyber Threat in 2023. His specialty is Israeli national security strategy and decision-making, U.S.-Israel relations, and Middle East security policy. He's a prolific writer. He's already published some 250 op-eds in Israeli and American outlets. Chuck, with that introduction, I'll welcome you a second time to the podcast.
Thanks again.
So just to get the conversation started, would you mind just explaining to me a very basic question, which I failed to truly understand? What does it mean to be Israel's Deputy National Security Advisor?
Well, first of all, Israel only established a National Security Council in effect in 2000. And it's interesting that it was a time when a number of other countries with parliamentary systems, the UK, India, and others, within a year or two of the time that Israel established a council, they did as well. It's really an interesting innovation in a parliamentary system because the idea of a National Security Council is an American concept as a council that advises the president. And in the US, you have the cabinet, which isn't an important forum. The secretaries, the ministers in the American sense, are very important. But as a forum, the cabinet rarely has a great deal to do. And because of that, after World War II, the U.S. decided, well, we need a statutory forum for national security decision-making. So it's the president, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the head of CIA, a few other people. And the NSC became a very influential body in the U.S. over the years. There's been talk about establishing an NSC in Israel since forever. And it finally happened, as I said, in 2000. It started out as a cabinet decision that Netanyahu passed at the very end of his tenure in 2009. And then Ehud Barak wins, and he's followed by Sharon. And they weren't interested in the council. It had been established. It would have looked bad to disband it. So they didn't, but they didn't accord it very much interest. Then the Second Lebanon War, 2006, comes along. And because of the failures of the war, of the decision-making process at the time, the National Commission of Inquiry, which is established afterwards, strongly recommends that the NSC become a statutory organization and that its role be upgraded greatly. And in 2008, the legislation is passed by the Knesset. And since then, you see just a growing trajectory of the council's influence. And because Netanyahu, maybe his American background, maybe just he's minded to the idea of having a advisory body for the prime minister more than some of his predecessors, he's given it an increasingly important role. And today it's one of the major players in the Israeli system. And that's a long background to answer to your question, but what it means is that the council as a whole advises the prime minister on areas of national security, defense, foreign affairs, domestic matters that are directly related to national security. And you could say, well, what is he needed for? There's a Ministry of Defense, there's the IDF, there's the Foreign Ministry, and that's true, but they each deal with a certain area of responsibility. They report to their ministers. And remember, ministers in Israel, unlike American secretaries, are not beholden to the prime minister. Sometimes there is chief political rivals. So here, this is a body which just serves the prime minister and is supposed to take a broad, integrative national approach.
Fascinating. And so that's from the political governmental side. How does that role and all of the know-how tie into your collaboration with the universities? and academia?
Well, you don't have to have been part of a national security council or even part of any government to be an academic. And most academics, I'm talking people in political science and related affairs, most have had straight academic careers. I'm a little bit of an anomaly because I came with, let's say, over half of my career being in government, but there are lots of other people like myself, actually. I think it provides you with an extra strength, when you've seen the real world from the inside and how things actually happen. And then if you have a good theoretical background as a political scientist, I think it makes you a better analyst in the end.
So, just to go on a tangent for half a second, what does it mean to be an excellent analyst in your case?
Ooh, that's a tough one. What does it mean to be an excellent analyst? Well, I would like to say to get it right, but since so many of us or most of us are wrong so often, then that's maybe not a good criterion. But yeah, it would be nice. It would be nice to think that we do it at least sometimes. Look, in the end, it's the depth of the knowledge that you bring, your ability to express it. And here's where the experience in government, both in how you express things, but in how things are really done and understanding it. The theory is very fine, but in the end, governments don't operate on the basis of political science theory.
Why don't governments operate on the basis of political science theory?
Because
Seems kind of strange because like isn't that what the whole purpose is of that academic field? Isn't it supposed to supply the government and politicians with like real material to make good decisions?
Well, first of all, a lot of people in the political science world are really just involved with theory and don't have much real world expertise to offer. Others who do, but their expertise tends to be in broad terms. It tends to be historic. You take a very young analyst, intelligence analyst, or some other governmental analyst who is just reading and writing all day. That's all he's doing or she is doing for sometimes 10 and 12 hours a day, reading and writing, reading and writing. And then you take a 20-something-year-old, and then you take a professor who's in his 50s and he's been dealing with this stuff for 30 years, but he doesn't do that on a daily basis. He writes books, he writes journal articles. He or she is not nearly as up to date. There are some, by the way, and there's some who are excellent. And they bring their theoretical background, and that makes them, and their historical knowledge, and that makes them very good analysts. But most, if what you're interested in is tell me, and this is what policymakers want, tell me what's happening now, what might happen tomorrow. They don't care about theory. They don't care about history. And that's why there's a divide between political science as an academic field and people who deal with political science in the real world. And I can tell you just as a personal anecdote, when I first entered government, I had my master's degree, and I thought I was a pretty good student, and I knew my stuff. And I arrived in the Ministry of Defense, and basically it's like going to boot camp and starting life from scratch. Because by the way, I tell my students who are interested in academic careers, in governmental careers, and people, let's say, who've got their masters or maybe even PhDs, and I say, you're going to have to unlearn everything that you have spent years and lots of effort and lots of money learning, because the analytical tools that you were taught in a university are very different from what is used in the government.
I don't want to. I mean, I'm a humorous man, but the only thought I could have is, you just like working your time saying that you get no respect, no respect.
And the first couple of years are really hard because everything that you write and you once thought you knew how to write well is being rewritten. And sometimes by the time it goes up a echelon or two, you can barely recognize what you wrote. But when you finish that learning process, again, I think it's an incomparable learning process that people, straight academics who've never gone through it, don't have.
Okay, so I'm going to jump one more time here because I heard another interesting note there, which is that what content that you create, the articles that you write, the op-eds, etc., that they must be translated as they travel upwards through various echelons in order for them to actually be digested or even reviewed by people in important decision-making positions. Isn't that the same as saying that the transfer of knowledge from the hands of the intelligentsia to the decision makers is an equivalent of broken telephone?
No, I wouldn't call it broken telephone, but there is definitely very often major difference between what the desk analyst and the senior intelligence officer, senior strategic planning persons, certainly decision maker, are reading. Now, remember, the young and what they need. The young or just the more junior analyst may be, I mean, once let's say they're immersed in their field, once they've been in place for a while, maybe they have a better understanding, a better feel for every little detail of what's happening that day. But as it goes up the chain, you have people who have an increasingly broad perspective and understand it as such, analyze it as such, and they add greater wealth and depth to it if they're doing their job properly. And when it gets up to the decision maker level, they don't want to know every detail. They don't have time. As a former analyst, I must say it was quite disconcerting for me when I learned that, for example, this was an example with Prime Minister Sharon. His aides would take the kinds of reports that he was getting from intelligence and from the other government agencies. And it's not that they would just give him, let's say, the executive summary. They would take a highlighter and mark 2 or 3 lines from the executive summary. That's all he'd read, because he doesn't, not because he didn't want to, not because he was a superficial person. These people have no time to breathe. Sharon, as a matter of fact, used to get his first briefing in the morning from his military secretary while he was shaving, literally, because shaving time is time. When you're in those levels, it's incredible. And people are shoving papers in your face as you get into the car. And you're going and meeting with party members and citizens and members of Knesset and foreign dignitaries and officials from it. They are under a kind of time pressure that until you've seen it, and even once you've seen it, is really
I know that might be a strange question, but I never heard it asked before. Why not have like 2 prime ministers instead of
prime
one?
ministers?
Yeah, like for example, one sits in the limo and reads the paperwork, and the other one goes out and shakes everyone's hands.
Well, in Israel, to a certain extent, we have that. He's called the president, who's the figurehead and does the ceremonial stuff. Now, of course, the prime minister is still left with some ceremonial activity, and he's left with a lot of political activity, which the president doesn't do. But there is something of a divide in that sense in Israel.
See, that's what I think may be strange, because I mean, that's why I'm saying it's just a theoretical question, because if the person that's reading your material doesn't have the same amount of decision-making power as you, then that imbalance also creates it could create an imbalance of responsibility or commitment to actually reading the material, because the point is that all of the information is building up. You're making decisions in real time, reading a few lines out of an executive summary, when the bottom line is that it's okay for today because maybe it's not so pressing. You have to read the full bit on whatever the most pressing priority issues are of the day, of course. But when do you get back around to that material? And by the time you do, what exactly has transpired? I feel like that actually ties into what's happening today. Like if we just drive into the current situation, the transfer of information on October 6th has been a major focus in just the public, and questions around how it was possible for oversight to have even taken place when Israel is such an amazing information superpower. Yeah, it's a scenario that we could drive into, but I wouldn't want to, especially because of what's happening with Israel and Iran. I'm interested in how the prime minister and the president and everyone involved in the decision-making process, especially where you fit into this with the different interviews and articles you've been writing. When we move into the active zone of proactively prevent bad scenarios from occurring by preemptive striking. We have taken ourselves from responding to events as they occur, which is fine because then it gives you time to catch up on information and just deal with what's happening in the day. I think that's how most countries operate. And then moving into a proactive zone where you have to say to yourself, I've reviewed all of the material effectively, or I should at least say so, that I've reviewed sufficient information in order to now make a proactive decision, even if it goes against the advice and guidance of partnering nations that we rely so heavily on for some things. So how can we talk about the information that was passed on in October 10th that was let's call it a breach in information passing, and how just a couple years later we moved into a proactive scenario where we effectively reviewed everything we needed to know, and then we started becoming a first actor.
First of all, prime ministers read what they have time to read. Sometimes if it's a topic that they're particularly interested in, of course, they'll sit and read an entire or even lengthy document. But for the most part, that's not the case. They simply don't have the time, and it's something like what I was describing before. There's no guarantee against failures. There's no perfect decision-making process. Look at the U.S., which may have the most sophisticated national security decision-making process of any country. And I'm talking in the pre-Trump era. And it has gotten it wrong royally many times. And the same is true for every country. And you can take... You're absolutely right. You called Israel an information superpower. We have a very sophisticated system, one of the more sophisticated ones in the world. And we had October 6th, 1973, and we had October 7th, 2023, 50 years and one day later. Sometimes really smart people screw up really badly. It's not just a matter of getting them and getting decision makers to read material, to understand the material, but they have to be willing to accept it. You can't force them to accept what you said. And by the way, very often they say, hey, who elected you prime minister? Or, there's a reason I got elected here. I've been around for a very long time. I've been briefed by the best and the brightest in Israel and abroad. In many cases, I'm directly involved in affairs that you don't know about, or I know far more about. When you talk about intelligence people in countries like Israel, the US, UK, Canada, strong democracies, there is a clear division between intelligence and policy. The intelligence people don't usually know what their side is doing, and they're not supposed to know. And they're not apprised of what's happening. How are they then going to assess events in which you are an active participant? If I'm making this up now, you're Israel and you're asked to assess what's happening in South Africa, okay. What's happening in Chile, I'm just trying to take places that are very far away from us. Okay. And nobody knows more than you do about that because they aren't in the center of the focus of anyone's attention. But when you're talking about the issues, it's the Palestinian issue, Iran, issues that we're deeply involved in, Israel is 50% of the picture, right? Sometimes a lot more than that. And you don't know about that. And the decision maker sometimes says, yeah, these guys, I know a lot more. Sometimes he or she is right. Sometimes the experts are right. But the experts remember, they're unelected. They supply the decision maker with information and advice. It's the decision maker's responsibility to make the decisions and hopefully make good ones. And when they don't, in democracies, we have the great fortune of being able to throw the bastards out once every 4 years or less in parliamentary systems.
Fascinating. Tell me about a decision. Well, let's look at a specific case. The pagers that exploded. Is that an example of a decision top down or bottom up? Like, would that be an example of one that comes out of very intelligent strategists from the academia? Or is that coming from some other place that would be unbeknownst?
No, the pager and the walkie-talkie affair is going to go down in the annals of espionage, of intelligence operations, as one of the greatest cases ever. This was brilliance. But this was something that was, and this is all open source information that I'm saying now. The Mossad worked on this for 10 years, maybe even a little more. And I think for a very long part of that period, they didn't know if it would ever be used and if it would ever actually work, because there were so many different things that had to come together. And in the end, the timing seemed to be a matter just of, it was use it or lose it. Hezbollah had gotten information about it, or they'd gotten quite suspicious about it, sent one of the phones off to Iran for them to look at it. And so we had to use it before we couldn't. This wasn't a matter of great strategic thinking. One of the biggest strategic transformations imaginable, decimating Hezbollah. Hezbollah was our primary enemy for the last 20 years. Of course, we were afraid of a nuclear Iran, but Iran wasn't there yet. And we underestimated Hamas. In the past, maybe no, but certainly on October 7th. It was Hezbollah. And this wasn't strategic brilliance. This was operational brilliance or intelligence brilliance. But the timing was almost a matter of just good fortune.
So that's an interesting situation, and it's nice to see where it comes from. It's straight Mossad planning, 10 years, and it wasn't necessarily activated at the time it was intended to be activated. But that's how the world works, is there's theory and then there's practice. It's very interesting. So with regards to Iran decision making right now, considering that Iran really is the focal point, it's the hub, for example, receiving such samples, running tests, providing reports, giving executive ordinances to the various factions that are working for it throughout the Middle East and abroad. What exactly are they going through in their thought processes? I mean, the leadership has been fractured and decimated, except for the very top. And there are so many different types of uses of different channels of communication, such as through social media, Twitter. We see the president speaking through Twitter and the prime minister, etc. Posturing. What exactly is going through Iran's mind right now, and how are they able to move forward here in a way that's going to be good for the people, that will effectively reduce the separation between the good citizens and the citizens of the world, enhance freedom for all of the good actors out there, and improve the future for the Middle East and the world? What can they do to move themselves in that direction? What's on the table for them? What's practical? And are they even thinking that way?
I think, first of all, you have to know something about Iran, in the sense that Iran is not just another state of the almost 200 in the world today. Iran is the Islamic Republic. The revolution was in 1979. Iran defines itself, or the regime defines itself, as the embodiment of the divine word on earth. And so that the supreme leader, who's known as the Islamist jurist, he interprets the divine word. And so, first of all, the Iranian regime, like any other regime, like in any other country, takes its own longevity, regime stability very, very seriously. If you don't have a government, then everything else doesn't matter. You're not going to be able to defend your people and promote prosperity, whatever. But in this case, if the regime were to be toppled, you're talking sort of toppling God, their interpretation of God. And so if you ask me what's going through their minds at the moment, I would say fear, panic, petrification, because for the first time, they may face a threat, an external threat to the regime. They've been dealing with domestic opposition for years, but so far have always been able to put it down very successfully. They were afraid after the second Gulf War that the U.S. might come after them for a while, but that didn't happen. Now, Israel hasn't officially adopted regime change as the objective of the war, but basically it has added it to the objectives. And if the U.S. gets involved, then for those who speak Yiddish, which I do not, but from my grandparents I know, that's what's known as gehackte Tzulis. And in more colloquial English, I would think we could call it being in deep shit. The U.S., we may be able to start some things. We may be able to set in motion some processes that could lead to the regime's toppling, but we have a limited ability to do so. The U.S., if it wants, can really do it. And that's one thing. I mean, they are, I think, very, very concerned about the regime. They are also, I think, still suffering from shell shock, because in their worst nightmares, Friday, June 13th was not supposed to have happened, when we took them totally by surprise, decapitated a very significant part of the military leadership. Obviously could have done so with the civil leadership, including the supreme leader, but did not. We have greatly downgraded their nuclear capabilities, some of their other military capabilities. Israel controls Iran's airspace at this point, so basically the whole country is vulnerable to Israel. So they are very, very scared. They cannot afford to lose this war, both for the theocratic reasons that I said before, because no country wants to lose a war. They're in
How are they able to
position.
make decisions right now? How are they able to communicate? I mean, aren't their lines of communication totally broken at this point?
I don't know. I don't know that Israel is, I mean, I haven't seen reporting indicating that Israel's disrupted their internal communications.
Because for example, like the citizens, right? They're like supposed to be online, I guess, receiving updates, broadcasts, maybe radio, telling them, giving them all the reasons to continue to maintain support for the regime.
So
How are they able to maintain the regime anyways at this point? If I maybe ask the question better.
first of all, they shut down their internet pretty much since the war began, because They're afraid that it's a source of information for Israel and a means for domestic opposition to get organized, to get going. They've done this on a number of occasions in the past when they were afraid of domestic opposition. But there are sources, or there are other channels of information. And here maybe we have a generational difference. It's not just the internet. There's something called a newspaper. Lots of people in Iran read newspapers, and there's TV and radio news, which young people in the West today do not read or listen to very much. But in Iran, they do more. And if the internet has been shut down, then of course those are the channels available, and they're all state-run or state-controlled in Iran's case.
So that would actually push them farther into, wouldn't that push the average civilians to become even more extremist just by the exposure to more biased media without exposure to more mainstream Western media?
Well, in normal times, actually, the Iranian people are known to be very, very, very avid users of the internet, and they're plugged into international media so that they have a better understanding. Now they don't. And so they're hearing just what the regime wants them to hear.
So it seems like the regime has some major challenges ahead of it. I guess, like, if I could try to understand the theocratic perspective in more detail, is it that difficult to justify a scenario where their belief system and the belief systems of the world that are trying to call for acceptance, collective acceptance, is it difficult to justify us finding a way to bridge the gap between their belief systems and those that seek peace and acceptance in the world?
I think it's hard. The West, ever since the Islamic Revolution, has tried to find ways to preferably topple the regime. And if you couldn't change the regime itself, at least change its behavior. And Iran has remained a revolutionary regime. It's calmed down a little bit over the years, but it's remained a revolutionary regime with extremist objectives, which it goes around pursuing in a way that other countries don't. So they built up enormous proxy players in the region, first and foremost Hezbollah, and then Hamas and the Houthis and others, huge Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria. They don't play by the games, by the rules of the accepted international game. They've conducted assassinations of dissident figures abroad, around Europe. They've conducted lots and lots of cyber campaigns against countries abroad, including, this is a little bit presumptuous, trying to destabilize recent American elections, starting in 2016. They've intervened in numerous other countries' electoral systems. And you see, for example, the difference in the way the international community views the ongoing war in Gaza. We had a lot of support the first couple of weeks when there was a feeling that Israel had been statingly attacked and maybe its existence had been in some danger. And you saw a huge outpour of public sympathy around the world in publics, and every Western leader came to Jerusalem within the first week or two. But then I don't have to tell you, and I'm sure not viewers, that, let's say, Israel is no longer very popular in the West. And here you saw when Israel was very unpopular, and France was about to hold a conference, co-hosting a conference with the Saudis the following week, which was supposed to lead to the establishment of a Palestinian state. And so there was a lot of tension between France and Israel about that, and with the West as a whole over Gaza and the entire Palestinian issue. And then Israel goes and out of the blue attacks Iran. Now, it wasn't entirely out of the blue because there are a whole variety of very good reasons that it happened now, but nobody was expecting it on Friday the 13th or any time in June or in this period of time. And again, you see the Western world, at least the leaders, strongly supporting Israel. You saw the G7 coming out with a very supportive statement, because everyone recognizes that Iran is a different story. It's an extremist actor. It is, or it does pose an existential threat to Israel, a severe threat to Gulf security, and because of oil to international security. Iran's a different story.
Iran, what I saw, at least until recently, 2023, is supposed to have the #1 GDP in the MENA region. I mean, aren't they providing the staples for the region for food? Like, don't they provide certain types of services besides oil that supply the region, or are they simply tied to oil? What are they actually contributing?
Oil is their biggest export. Used to be something like 80%, but they've brought that down because they have tried to diversify the economy somewhat in recent years. But Iran has been under American sanctions ever since 1996. Then it was under international sanctions for a number of years. But even after the US left the 2015 nuclear deal in 2018, Trump withdrew at the time, and the sanctions basically came apart, but not the American sanctions. And pretty much all of the Western companies have been, even if from a European perspective, they could go and trade with Iran, they were afraid of the secondary effect of American sanctions. And so they haven't. And the Iranian economy is in a shambles because of the sanctions and simply because of gross economic mismanagement by Iran itself.
I like you're about as close as we can get to a profit right now on the topic. So let's just try to find out what's going to
You
happen
know
and
the
what's going to be
expression,
in.
the gift of prophecy ended in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago, right?
Yeah, well, it's either you or I'm gonna have to ask GPT, and I much prefer to ask you. So
Okay.
please, the experts get to tell me there's going to become a huge vacuum in the region, right? Or there already is one that's growing. So how does the vacuum get filled, practically speaking, by the other nations in the region?
Okay. Well, first of all, the war is maybe still in its early stages. I don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know yet what the real outcome is. We had a very successful opening day or two. We've had a successful ongoing campaign, but we don't know what the long-term effect of this is. If the war were to end today, then we could say that maybe Israel postponed the nuclear program by about a half a year and significantly downgraded the ballistic missile arsenal, but they still have a very significant piece of it. Now, so that's where we are today. Now, fast forward a couple of few weeks from now, does this turn into an Israel bombs? Well, Israel succeeds in destroying Fordo, which is the main nuclear site, and everyone thinks that Israel does not have the capability to do this one because it's a big mountain that the Iranians built a many, many meters thick reinforced concrete bunker in which they built an enrichment plant. That everybody thinks that only the U.S. can take that out. Is Fordo there or not? Whether we do it, whether the U.S. does it in the next few weeks.
Can we even do it, by the way? Why? It has to do with just like general, like international laws around the power of certain types of weapons that just simply couldn't, like they're not allowed to be in possession by other countries or something.
I mean, look, it's a huge 6-kilometer square complex, and it's this mountain. And only the U.S. would build a special, it's not a bunker buster, it's a mountain buster. Most people don't think that Israel can cause more than minimal damage to Fordo. So that's one big question mark. Will the regime, this won't be in the next couple of weeks, will it be destabilized or not? How badly will we be hit? Who's going to end up winning this war? And let's say in hopeful analysis that we do, and Iran ends the war greatly weakened, then there is something of a power vacuum that, as you were indicating. And then who fills it? Well, the Sunni states, the Gulf states, Turkey, not a friend of ours today. And a lot of people are afraid that in the Arab world, of course, that Israel will be a dominant regional player, maybe even a regional hegemon. I think that's greatly overstating it. We're a bit too small to be a hegemon. But yes, if Iran is greatly weakened, then the two big and powerful players left are Israel and Turkey. And of course, the Saudis, the Emiratis in the economic and partly in the diplomatic realm.
Iran, it's a silly question, but how does Iran actually ship the oil to the rest of the world? Is it going through a pipe or is it going through freighters?
Most of their exports, I mean, there are lots of pipelines in Iran itself, but most of the exports go through the Persian Gulf. And today, almost all of it is bought by China because of the American sanctions. The Indians probably are buying some, maybe South Korea, but it's overwhelmingly to China.
It's interesting you mentioned that because I recently read that both China and Russia offered to mediate between Israel and Iran. China is supposed to be kind of global power that, because for thousands of years it has survived by kind of recluding itself from the rest of the world's involvement in these kinds of military campaigns. On the other hand, we can see that China is, like you said, it's the one that's buying all the oil from Iran. And we saw that an Iran oil field was hit, and that may actually lead to some kind of strain on China. For China, as one example, to get involved and try to mediate between Israel and Iran, what would the possible interests that they hold be, and how or why would they want to get involved for their own reasons?
Well, I think you said why they would want for their own reasons, because they want to ensure that the oil flows. Okay. China isn't a big military or diplomatic player in the Middle East. It's a very big economic player because of its oil purchases. I said it buys most of Iran's oil. It buys a very large part of the Saudis and I presume some of the others' oil. So they're a big economic player here. And so they have major interests at stake in what's going on in the Mideast. But I wouldn't spend too much time on this because there isn't a chance in the million that Israel will agree to have China as a mediator. It's not a disinterested party. It's an ally of Iran's. And we're in the American camp. Either the U.S. will mediate, or if the U.S. gets directly involved, it may ask the Europeans to intervene and mediate on its behalf. But we'll be going through the U.S. and maybe Europe, not through Russia or China.
I think it's interesting to see how that translates into recently the president spoke about how he wants to bring production back into the US, and how that's now, it looks to be a trend just across the world, and avoiding outsourcing the creation of products. And if the prices of fuel go up, if China isn't able to produce for this at the same pricing with at the same competitive angle that it's been doing, would that end up pushing these other economies to become more self-sufficient faster? That's part of what I'm trying to understand. The other piece of it is, will we end up with a supply shortage because companies or let's say the major manufacturers are going to refuse to actually produce, since it's going to cost them too much, it's not going to be worth it for them? Like, can we see the kind of trends for supply shortages and price hikes already?
So you're talking shortages for the global economy or for the regional actors?
I would say global because, for example, if we look at China, just as a global player for its production, it's manufacturing so much of the parts of things that we need, it can have a massive impact if China's not able to produce at the same pricing.
Absolutely. But you're getting into an area which isn't my area of expertise. So I'll leave it
Fascinating.
to others who are wiser than I am.
Fascinating. So then we could tie right back into something else. I just think that it's interesting to see how we're so early on in the war at just the different interests that can begin to show up as just we begin to speculate. Um, let's move into cyber power and cyber threats. Let's see here. There's a number of Israeli cyber startups that actually have been extremely successful in both protecting Israeli data interests, but also have in some ways been used to breach data privacy in other camps. Could you speak about Israel and the current cybersecurity threats that face it because of the war situation?
Well, you're raising two different issues. One was the Israel's involvement, or Israeli companies' involvement, in offensive cyber uses abroad and in some cases misuses. And the other issue is now cyber during the war. I can say that the Iranians have been using cyber. They've tried to attack many Israeli sites. They haven't been very successful. They're using the internet as a means of recruiting agents in Israel. And here we've discovered and arrested a couple of tens of people already in recent months and during the war. It's horrible to think that Israelis were willing to do this. They all knew who they were getting paid by, and these were people who were all in, let's say, difficult financial straits, and so they were willing to sell out, but very, very disturbing. And they're using cyber information warfare as a means of getting their message out in the world and trying to undermine the Israeli position, weaken the American position. In terms of the first issue, we're talking mostly about the NSO company. They're the ones who were accused of most of the violations. Now, I understand the feeling of, they were getting into private citizens' phones. There's a violation of privacy here. And there were a couple of cases where it went beyond violations of privacy. It was used by a couple of unsavory regimes to deal with their opponents, and one or two people may even have died as a result. So it's not nice. There's no doubt about that. But the countries that were criticizing Israel, the US and all of Europe, and I'm not talking about the rest of the world, sell billions and billions of dollars worth of weapons to the Arab countries and to other dictatorial regimes. And these weapons kill people. I mean, they're designed to kill people. It's not that, yes, there were one or two unfortunate cases where somebody paid with their life. Here you're talking potentially mass casualties. Why do you sell the most advanced weapons in the world? So, first of all, Israel clamped down on this and ended it essentially completely, and some companies have gone out of business as a result. NSO is a shadow of what it was. But I think there was a double moral standard here. I think the issue gained so much attention around the world, and it was really remarkable because it was Israel. And any time today in the last decade that you can get a headline which discredits Israel in any way, then that's a good way to sell newspapers. So I think we have to put that whole issue in a certain perspective.
Why is the world so after Israel? Like, why is Israel always such a focus, even though it's such a small spot on the map? And why is it always judged? Why is there's such a discrepancy in the expressions of love and admiration for the country and the people?
I looked up some time ago, and if I remember correctly, the figure is that Israel is 0.0001% of the world's population. My only question here is if I'm not missing a zero. I think I got it right. So a small dot on the map, a small minuscule piece of the global population, and boy, do we receive a disproportionate share of world attention and world enmity. And I'm not going to talk about the Arab world. The reasons there are obvious. It's military, it's cultural, it's religious, it's various things. In the West, the picture is far more complicated. There is still a strong base of support for Israel as a democracy, as a liberal society, for let's say the older generations, because young people who grew up in the post-67 era don't really remember this, but of the old pioneering, daring Israel, courageous, and the ingathering of the exiles, and of course, Holocaust sympathy. There is still a strong base of support for Israel on that basis. But Israel for the last few decades, and if you want, you can say since 67, has been pursuing policies towards the Palestinians and the West Bank that the world doesn't accept, correctly or incorrectly. I'm not going into the substance now. And there's no doubt that the world misunderstands a lot of the issue, doesn't understand the issue, just has very little information, and misunderstands what they do know. There is no issue that has undermined Israel's image more than the settlements issue. Limited its West Bank policy to the security dimension, that actually is understood. Maybe not fully, not properly, but it's understood. But settlements, no one in the world, including our best friends, understands that. And not only do they not understand why we're doing it, but they view it as something which, if Israel is supposed to be a Jewish and democratic country, if that's a raison d'etre, how are you doing something which seems to undermine those two very things? And you have generation after generation that's grown up in the West, hearing this narrative about the settlements, viewing Israel as a occupier, an increasingly brutal occupier. We used to talk about the benevolent occupation. Let's be honest, it's been a few decades since it's been benevolent, maybe because we had no choice. But it's been an increasingly not nice, if not brutal occupation. Then you have the Arab, the Palestinian information, PR onslaught, call it whatever you want. And Israel's accused of apartheid and genocide and every kind of discrimination and horrible thing you can think about. None of this has any bearing in reality. But we all know that when you repeat lies often enough, look, you see, by the way, in all of the polling in the West, including in the US, as age goes down, support for Israel plummets. People 60 and above still have a warm corner in their hearts for Israel, but have a growing problem with that. And young people do not. And we saw it on the campuses.
Concerning, but I can understand it. I mean, there's a pre and there's a post 67 that you're talking about.
Speak up,
where you
Daniel, I can hear you.
You have the pre 67 mindset of the pioneer, also post Holocaust mentality of we have nowhere else to go. We're kicked out of every country in the world for thousands of years, and we had enough as a Jewish people, and we have Jewish interests that we need to guarantee, not so much for ourselves as actually for our ancestors that gave everything for us. We are almost at the point where our population is the same as what it was before the Holocaust, to my understanding, but we're not quite there yet. We think about all the Jewish lives that were lost, sacrificing for us to be able to live here, not just anywhere, but to live in Israel. There's something about it that just it's non-negotiable, and I do see it manifest itself in the settlements where you have people that for them the thing that they really hold on to, that they understand about all of the chaos and misinformation, everything that they've been fed in their system, is that the land, they feel a connection to the land, and they're seeking a place that they feel they would want to rest in the land. And it's hard to explain like what it means to feel like you're home, but when it comes at the price of other people's freedoms, I understand that it's a major issue. It's very difficult to explain something which is not on a rational basis, like feeling at home and how important that is at the end of the day. I know everybody wants to feel that way. So I don't know where the solution is there, but I guess the young people are the ones that are going to have to deal with this one. They're going to have to figure out how to get along. If anything, we can see that a generation that has a lot of wisdom, a lot of experience are at the head. At some point, I guess the torch does have to get passed on. The question is, are we going to receive it as informed, knowledgeable, and thoughtful from a position of power and to make decisions that are good and true? Or are we all going to step into those roles for our own interests and only take on the burden of what was left before us because it doesn't really matter on our day-to-day lives? Maybe it affects the rest of the people, but can we actually step towards embodying the people? Can we step into these positions of power and look and see the discrepancies, find a way to get along without having to resort to warfare? These are all things which I hope we can arrive at some conclusions about from our talk today, Chuck. I couldn't have asked for a better guest to have on my podcast, especially at a time like this. And I hope that we can get you back on again in the future.
Thanks very much for having me, and absolutely look forward to it.
And by the way, just before we go, if there are there any books or articles or anything you'd like to mention for the audience to check out?
Well, you mentioned my books in the beginning, but of course, I can't miss an opportunity to try and sell them again. So, for those who are interested in how Israel actually makes national security policy, my book is called Zion's Dilemmas: How Israel Makes National Security Policy. For those who are interested in a much broader picture of Israel's national security strategy, how it developed over the decades from the time it was first formulated by Ben-Gurion and up to this day, and what the challenges and the threats and maybe the opportunities are, and how Israel maybe should formulate its strategy or what it should be, then I would suggest my other book, Israeli National Security, A New Strategy for an Era of Change. And for those who are interested in the whole cyber issue, whether it's how Israel became a cyber power, one of the biggest in the world, actually one of the leading centers of cybersecurity, and cyber threats to Israel from Iran, Hezbollah, and others, I would suggest my other book about Israel and cyber.
Well, Chuck, thank you so much for your time today. I'll be checking out your books and also recommend it to the viewership. Have yourself a safe and secure weekend and all the best.
And you too. And next time we get together, I hope there will be more encouraging news to talk about.
Amen.
Shabbat Shalom.